Hello once again, followers and friends of Inform Scotland. After doing today's deaths update, I was just sort of finishing off this tableau of deaths in Scotland from 1974 because you may remember, you may have seen on our blog, informscotland.uk, the blog which is titled An Update on All-Cause Deaths up to 25th of October. The first graph, or the graph that I show in the cover image, is of all-cause mortality since 1974 in Scotland, and what it shows is that 2021 is highly unusual. So I've separated out the mortality for Scotland since 1974 into separate graphs for every year. Now, I have made, just for continuity, the scale on the y-axis is 0.2 to 0.5, that's to accommodate high mortality years. We never really have less than 0.2 for mortality per year. Now this is deaths per 1,000. So that's the y-axis, and then the x-axis is weeks. So I just want to talk to you about like the shapes of the years and what you can tell by looking at the years individually. So 1974 was a fairly typical year. In between, the mortalities ranged between 0.2 and 0.3, and you see that it went to a minimum at about week 30, so that's like July, August, and then it rose back up as we went into the winter. And then you see it continuing into 1975, and it goes down, minimum between 30 and 40, weeks 30 and 40, and then an increase again, but much smaller than the year before into the winter. Then in 1976, at the start of the year, we had an unusual peak in mortality, followed by a reduction, and then it went back up again. And then 1977, after this big rise here, we saw what I think you could agree, just comparing them, this looks slightly lower than normal, then we went up again. 1978, 1979 seems to be very low mortality, 1980 very low mortality, 1981 very low mortality. 1982 we had quite a bad winter. And look how it came down nice and slowly. Again, minimum between weeks 30 and 40, back up. Low mortality year 1983, low mortality year 1984, low 1985. And then in 1986, we had a tough winter. Look at that. Similar to 1982, we had a peak approaching 0.4 at the start of the year, and then it went down and it was completely flat for the rest of the year. That compensated for this peak in mortality year. And then 1987 was nice and low after a slight surge in the winter. It was obviously a bit of flu going around or something. 1988 looks normal and low. 1989, look at that, perfectly normal year. Again, we had low mortality this winter, and then the flu of 1989 hit and mortality went through the roof. That was very severe, approaching 0.5 per 1,000, and that's in 1 week. And then 1990 comes back down, and after this terrible mortality year 1989, you've got really low mortality. And then everything is very quiet through 1991, 1992. 1993 is maybe a little bit worse because you can't just have low mortality indefinitely. It has to come to an end. Then you see a low mortality year 1994, very quiet year through 1995 until a wee surge in the winter. Obviously this 1995-1996 winter, there was a wee bit of flu or something, then low mortality again to compensate. Another bad winter in 1997, low mortality to compensate. Then 1998, we peak in the winter, followed by low mortality. And you see, as we move into the late 90s, where the line was hovering more sort of halfway between 0.2 and 0.3, it's now sitting on 0.2. Now, we had a bad winter again, 1999. We're sitting at a lower mortality because this is a period where people's life expectancy has been going up. And so that means we've got fewer people dying. We've got more and more old people accumulating in our population, which is lovely. We get to keep our grandparents for longer. Wonderful. That's because of the miracles of modern medicine. But it means that as time goes on, you're more susceptible to peaks because you've got lots and lots of susceptible people accumulating in your population. So 1999, we saw this big wave in flu or something, and again, after this wave, it drops down to normal or sort of subnormal levels of mortality. And then 2001, after this bad year, we have a nice quiet year. 2002 was quiet. 2003 was quiet. We had a wee bump in deaths in 2004, and again followed by a quiet period. 2005's quiet, 2006 quiet, 2007's quiet. Now that's a wee peak in mortality. Now you look back to earlier years, right? So we're at 2007 I was at. Now if you go back to like 1986, see, that was more a normal winter level there that we're seeing in 2007. But that's unusual now. That's because we have a growing elderly population, and that's continuing to our elderly numbers are continuing to increase through this time. 2008, really see how it's kind of trending down. We're now dipping below the 0.2 quite often. And then again, we had a wee surge in 2009, a normal winter surge, but again, followed by a period of really low mortality. A slight bump in 2010, and then we've got more low mortality, more low mortality, more low mortality 2013. Really low mortality actually. Do you see how that area under this 0.2 line is starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger? Then we move to 2014. We have a very minor bump in mortality that winter. Do you see how low that is compared to, for example, 2000? Low mortality followed by a wee bump in deaths, but again, that wouldn't have looked anything unusual at all in 1974, in the 70s. All followed by low mortality, and then 2018, that was our bad flu year, okay? So our bad flu year, we saw a similar number of deaths or similar peak in deaths to what we saw in 2020. Do you see that? The peak there is between about just above 0.35, and here it was just above 0.35. And then 2019, we had a very small bump in mortality. And then we had this bump in mortality coming into the new year 2020, followed by this surge, which is not unusual in terms of peak, but it's incredibly unusual in terms of location in the year, right? There has never been a peak at that time of year except in 1976. So in 1976, week 10, we saw a peak about 0.35. In 2020, we've seen a peak about 0.35, but after week 15. This is a really unusual time to see death happening. But then we saw a brief period of kind of low mortality and then a bump over the winter again, which is unusual. Okay, this is the time we lock down, and this is the next time we lock down. And then look there, we see again quite a high period of mortality, but actually not that unusual. I've been guilty of this too, talking about excess deaths in the January, but actually in 2018 we saw something very similar. This one has taken much longer to come down. And then now, where it's been quite normal to skip along under the 0.2 line through to week 40, we have been rising since week 20. Now, that might look quite subtle on these graphs, okay? That might look quite subtle. But actually what this represents is a lot of people dying. And we are now, you know, at 0.25 at week 40, or just going past week 40, which has never happened. Literally never happened. 0.25, nope, nope. You see that? Going back to 1970s, even in the 1970s, when death was generally much higher than it is now. In 1974, we were approaching 0.25 in week 40, but it wasn't part of that was just the start of the increase. What we have seen is increases since week 20 this year. This is unheard of. Okay? So I hope you found this interesting. I just wanted to give you a bigger picture of mortality and how 2021 and 2020 look highly unusual. And of course, more than the disease that we've been living with has been unusual, the measures that we have taken have been unusual. And that's the point I would like to drive home. Thank you so much again for your attention. Those of you who've watched 3 videos from me in 24 hours deserve a medal, frankly. I love you.